All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Probably really don't need this microphone.
Yes, you do.
Oh, we're recording, right?
Yeah.
So yes, I do need it. It's really great to see everyone here today. Thank you for joining us at our Weidenbaum event. I know that Yom Kippur starts at sundown today, so for all of our friends who observe, we wish them a meaningful fast. We're here in the center's conference room. Some of you, this might be the first time that you're in this space. This is the Weidenbaum Center. We have lots of faculty, offices, graduate students, undergraduates who fill this space. So thank you for joining us. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to the center itself. Today, we're going to hear from John Inazu, who is going to discuss his really wonderful book, Learning to Disagree: The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. Our discussion today is going to be moderated by Elizabeth Larson, the center's Associate Director of Research and Administration. After the talk, or if you feel so compelled even during the talk, you can go and purchase a copy of John's book. If you feel compelled, there's also wine. You can go help yourself too, as well as some snacks, which we'll all partake in after the talk is over. So now I'll go ahead and formally introduce Elizabeth and John. Elizabeth Larson is the Associate Director of Research and Administration for the Weidenbaum Center, where she played a vital role in managing the center's research programs. She oversees basically everything, budgets, and also works with our sponsors. Her work involves supporting faculty in securing external and internal grants, which is one of the very important things that the center does. She helps organize public events and handles fundraising and donor relations. Immediately before joining WashU, she was a consultant for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable. An attorney, Elizabeth is a member of the Missouri and Washington, D.C. Bar Associations. She also serves on the Community Advisory Board of St. Louis Public Radio, which is, of course, our local NPR member station. Elizabeth holds a BA from Boston College and earned her JD along with a dual master's degrees in journalism and human development and family studies from the University of Missouri. She lives in Fox Park in the city of St. Louis with her husband and 5 children. John Inazu is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion and Professor of Political Science. His scholarship focuses on the First Amendment, freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion, and related questions of legal and political theory. His books include the book that we will be discussing today, which I mentioned, Learning to Disagree: The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect, published in spring of 2024. Confident Pluralism: Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference, published by University of Chicago Press in 2016, and Liberty's Refuge: The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, published by Yale in 2012. John is the special editor of the volume on law and theology. His articles have appeared in a number of law reviews and journals, and he's written broadly for mainstream audiences and publications, including The Atlantic, USA Today, the LA Times, and the Washington Post. Prior to teaching law, John clerked for Judge Roger L. Woolman of U.S. Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit and served for 4 years as an Associate General Counsel with the Department of the Air Force at the time. So I'm going to turn it over, and will you please join me in welcoming John Inazu.
Thanks, Andrew. John, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for being here on a Friday afternoon.
Yes, thank you all for being here. I really loved your book. It was challenging and convicting and timely, as we've been talking about. So I don't have to tell any of you that we're living in a wildly polarizing time, and any disagreement seems to immediately become a moral question. And something that John points out is it's just exhausting. And we know this day to day, but it feels heightened right now, perhaps because of the election in 24 days. So this conversation is needed, and I'm hoping it's a bit of a respite for those of us who want some sanity. So I would love to start at the literal beginning, and that is the title of your book. So I think disagreement seems fundamental and natural to human beings. And as I was reading your book, I wondered, did a previous generation, did they have the skills to disagree and it's something that we've lost? Or is it something that we just naturally lack as humans and it's something that we have to learn?
Great question. I think more of the latter. I mean, so the title is learning as this ongoing active verb that we never quite finish. And that also means we practice, we make mistakes, we try to get better at it. And that's true of our generation, but it's also true of every previous generation. I don't think anybody just kind of shows up and is ready to be an expert at disagreement. So I do think it takes some practice and patience, and that's also not unique to us or our time. I think there are probably aspects of our lives today, especially those of us who spend time online or with social media, that make it particularly hard to do the kinds of things we're going to talk about. But that's maybe the small part that feels different today.
So that kind of leads to my next question. Like, what does a healthy disagreement look like in practice? Like, you start, your very first point is watching a Twitter fight unfold.
Yeah.
And that we can all agree is very unhealthy.
That's not healthy.
Yes. So can you talk me through what a healthy disagreement would look like?
Yeah, well, so I think part of it, and this is actually the first point, is to recognize that we have these deep differences over things that matter that aren't going away. So we've got to start with the premise that we're stuck with disagreements. We're not just going to come to consensus. We can't just pretend it doesn't matter, pretend that we agree. So recognizing the reality and depths of our differences, and then figuring out what's at stake with those differences. A lot is at stake. And when we think about the upcoming presidential election, depending on your views of the world, a lot of human suffering or human flourishing follows from the next few weeks. That all really matters. And at the same time, in the midst of that, we can still identify and find common ground. At a place like Washington University, there are all kinds of different beliefs and ideologies, but we're all here ostensibly to be pursuing this educational mission together, and we can say that's our common ground. Or if you're at the medical school, patient care and research is your common ground. And as a city of St. Louis, we can maybe name some common ground issues and efforts that will bring us together. But you've got to kind of keep working at that and then keep reminding yourself of why you're in it together. I actually think it's much harder to do that at a national level right now.
Yeah.
What is the common ground of this country? Very hard question to answer. We see it a little bit when, I mean, look at the hurricanes on the East Coast. It's very quickly evident that you are helping your neighbor survive, and you set politics aside and you're putting sandbags down together or rescuing people from floods. That's very tangible common ground, but we can't rely just on natural disasters in the Olympics. So we have some urgent and big political questions at the national level. I think it's much more pragmatic and practical to identify common ground at local and institutional levels.
Something that you write about a lot is the importance of exactly what you're saying, understanding the other side and recognizing people's complexity is what can lead to empathy. One of the problems that I think we're all facing is maybe siloing and self-selecting into groups that believe the same thing that we do. Can you talk about ways to broaden our social circle, or maybe to get out of the echo chambers that we find ourselves in?
I mean, I think the first thing is we have to recognize how pervasive and how hard this is. We're literally moving into neighborhoods with people like us. We're finding jobs and choosing schools. So the big sort that's happening is extremely structural and extremely deep, and that matters. And then you go online and it exacerbates even more. So you're following the people you want, and the algorithms are feeding you what you want, and then suddenly you know, you get 20 likes on your tweet and you think America agrees with you, right? Really, all you've done is sort of with a small dopamine hit, reinforce your prior belief. And you might have no idea what your actual neighbors down the street think, or what most of the country thinks. So we do have to work very deliberately and very hard to get out of these echo chambers. And I mean, the very first practical step is to diversify our news sources. I mean, we are in a state of crisis with mainstream journalism, and it's not getting any better. I was on a panel with Nick Kristof at the New York Times. It was 2016, so 8 years ago. And at the time he said, if you think mainstream media is bad now, just hold on to your seats for the next 20 years. And we've already seen that start to unfold because of the financial incentives, because the pressures on newsrooms, the firing of editors, all of this is massively complicating how we get our news. So that means I think it's more incumbent on each of us to be smarter consumers of news and to recognize when we are in our own echo chambers. And frankly, most of them, with a few exceptions, most of the national sources are, you can't just rely on any one of them singularly, because you'll get a very skewed view of how the rest of the country is perceiving breaking news and current events.
So if I can just dig a little deeper then, so in addition to diversifying our news then, on a personal level, how would you recommend we kind of find those people?
Yeah, I mean, this is hard because it takes institutions.
How do I become friends, John?
I mean, you can't walk into a coffee shop and say, who disagrees with me politically? You gotta figure out how to do this naturally. And part of the problem we have is we are losing trust and commitment to institutions at all levels.
Mhm.
So we no longer have, I mean, the public library is kind of for most people, I think in the past, the bowling league, the social clubs that used to exist are less and less, and the ones that remain are very sorted politically and ideologically. So what's left in place of that? Well, I think places like Washington University could be real opportunities, right? The forums like this might be ways, but you've got to, I think, build on it with more than, as nice as the talk is and as good as a book is to read, you have to do it with more than one-off events. You have to commit to people and through a set of relationships over time. You know, so what would it look like to say to, maybe it's through the Weidenbaum Center or some other network you're already a part of, to say, with 6 people, we're going to commit to 5 sessions together. And we're going to spend an hour talking about an article or a book or something, and then we're going to go away and think about it and maybe do our own reading and come back 2 weeks later and do it again. And in that iterative trust building, which is also kind of how the academic semester works in some cases, you can start to go a little deeper with people who differ from you. But I think that takes a lot of planning and a lot of work, and it's very hard to replicate with a day of dialogue, you know, or a one-off meeting.
Yeah, there has to be a lot of buy-in, right?
It does, and trust.
Right, and trust. Kind of to that point a little bit, one thing that you recommend not doing is not starting the family with these hard conversations. And so I'm wondering if you have some advice for some people in the audience who are about to see some family members at Thanksgiving immediately following the election. How do you redirect?
Yeah.
How do you not have the hard conversation, or should you lean in if somebody wants to have the hard conversation? How do you balance that?
Yeah, so let me free you all of any Thanksgiving responsibility. Just don't do it, you know, stick to the food and the sports and the memories. And I've actually, you know, I get this question a lot, and I'm becoming more and more convinced that this intuition is right. Thanksgiving is already high stakes, and people are coming. And I remember my parents were in Colorado and driving 14 hours with the kids in the minivan and then showing up. Like, nobody is on their best at that point, right? This is like the worst possible setup for hard conversations. So don't do it. Stick to kind of reconnecting, especially, you know, with relatives, and you've got so much assumed shared memory and baselines that may not be there anymore. So take the time to use Thanksgiving as just a relationship refresher. And if you really want to have the hard conversation, then set up some other time to do that and say, and say, we need to talk through this, but we can't do it now. And then go into that conversation with a full tank, ready emotionally to have it, expecting to hear something that might not sit right, expecting maybe to be offended. But if you try to compress that in the mix of all the turkey and kids and everything else, it's not setting up for success. And I think, there is something, I talk about this in the book, there's something just very hard about family, because you have this shared sense of common experience and this assumption of trust that actually might no longer be there. That's also true, like anytime you have a split in any institution and the people you've been partnering or co-laboring with, and you realize, oh, we actually think differently about this fundamental point, and some people leave and some people stay. That's hard because those were your people and those were the people you trusted. And for a lot of people, that has been family. And then you wake up and you think, I feel like I don't even know this person anymore, because you don't even know this person anymore because you spent years away with different experiences and different news sources and different friends. And now you come back at Thanksgiving and expect to pick up where you were. And that's just not going to happen. So be free at Thanksgiving to watch football and talk about Easter.
Thank you. I will do that. One of the chapters encourages us to see the person as a person and not as a problem. And I am wondering how to reconcile that, I'm wondering how to do that when the other person, I might be able to do that, but what if the other party views me as the problem? It seems to happen sometimes. So I'm just wondering, how do I do that if they see me as the problem and I'm approaching it as seeing them as a person?
Right. Well, so I think we can expect in the world to have some asymmetry in our approaches to disagreement in relationships, and we should just expect some people not to be on the same page. If they don't have the capacity to engage with you, though, if all they want to do is fight, or they're too busy actually to sit down and have a conversation, then maybe that's a signal that this is not the relationship or the effort for me to engage in the moment. I mean, it does take a certain amount of shared commitment to have a conversation that is real and not constrained to a quick back and forth, and that is willing to engage in follow-ups and seeking clarity and that sort of thing. And I think when you go in asymmetrically, if one person wants to do it, the other person is too busy or too dismissive, that's unlikely to go well.
This is kind of similar, but what is your advice for people who truly view the nature of disagreement or the fight maybe as their job? Like, we are living with rhetoric right now that is so inflamed, and people believe, I mean, you were alluding to this earlier, right? The entirety of this country is on the line with your vote. And so you are going to approach this election and your vote matters because XYZ could happen and America could disintegrate based on your one vote. And so that's their job, is to convince you to vote their way or to do whatever on one issue. So how do you, it's missional.
Yeah.
Like how do you deal with that? What's your advice to that person? What's your advice to the person on the other side of that conversation?
Well, so first, some more good news. For anyone who thinks that democracy will end the day after the election for either outcome, that's not true. So you can rest peacefully. One of the reasons I know it's not true is I spent 4 years at the Pentagon, and the bureaucracy of our federal government is so slow moving that nothing happens overnight. So it's going to take a while for things to peter out, even I think in the worst case. But that doesn't mean things aren't high stakes. And I think maybe the first thing to remember is we've kind of lost our basic muscles about what politics is. Politics by nature, especially at the federal level, especially with a country as diverse and divided as ours, has to be about compromise. We're not going to get our way. The people that we elect into the Senate and the House and other places are not going to unilaterally impose their policy positions. And if they try, nothing is going to get done. We've seen this for years and years now. And there's a sense in which reimagining what politics is a compromise where nobody is fully satisfied or happy with the outcome, but then everybody is invited to keep having the conversation. And if you lose or you don't quite get what you want, you go back to the table and reimagine your argument and try to persuade other people to move the ball a little bit, but it can't be a winner take all. There's no way that our system is set up for that. And that's where I think we've just really kind of fallen off the rails in terms of how we're supposed to do government. This is true, like not just at the national level, but look at like the school board fights where people, it feels so zero sum, and it feels like good versus evil, and that's not what the school board is, that's not what the Congress is. We need to recover an understanding of how politics works. And then I think a key reminder of this is as an alternative to very bad things, right? Politics as a form of compromise, or our system of laws and policies, however imperfect and unjust and problematic they may be, are a far better alternative to street violence, which is happening in parts of the world today. And it's a far better alternative to the lack of government that most abuses the most vulnerable in our society. So when you can critique our government, you can want reform, you can be unsatisfied with how things are going, and at the same time say it's really important to commit to what we have because it prevents a whole lot more violence and suffering.
Okay, in your book, you advocate for assuming the best in others, as we've been talking about, even when we believe that they're deeply wrong, because that is how you cultivate empathy. And you recommend finding something good in those that we disagree with. So obviously, we've been talking about this climate of moral outrage and how pervasive it is. So how can we practically live out this principle of finding something good about those that we disagree with, even those whose views we find abhorrent, if we feel absolutely certain that those beliefs and then sometimes their actions are crossing, fundamental ethical lines that are uncrossable to us?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. I like the way you phrased it. We're gonna have to do a little bit of internal soul searching before we can answer that question, because what's happened functionally for many of us is we have put into that uncrossable category way too many things. So there are uncrossable categories, right? We're at Washington University and we're not welcoming the neo-Nazis to this room for good reason. And we say there are some things that we're just not gonna try to understand the other side there. But for most really hard issues, including the ones about which we have very strong convictions, there are going to be other people we think are deeply wrong, deeply misguided, harming society, and we can still come to a talk alongside of them. We can still get breakfast with them. We can still co-labor with them. And that says something functional about what we think about these other sides and these other arguments. And so part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to help people work to understand as best as possible why that other side is not just pure evil or stupid, right, or idiotic. And so one of the reasons I can do this in this book is because I locate so much of the storytelling in the law school classroom. This is, by the way, a book to convince all of you who think lawyers are the problem. That's really part of the solution. And it's because the best legal training and the best lawyering is actually understanding that other side as charitably as possible. Sometimes just to knock it down, but in the doing of that work to get to the other side, you are actually practicing a form of empathy. And in case after case, as you know from law school, you see these extremely hard issues and you come in with lots of priors and you think, well, my views about abortion or gay marriage or religious freedom or whatever, or criminal law are so fundamental to who I am and what I believe. And then you read these very hard cases over not just sort of cosmic good versus evil, but very precise clashes of these issues. And many of them are 5-4 decisions with very smart opinions on both sides. And you realize nobody in this case is stupid. Everybody is trying their best. They have very different views of what best is, but they're, for the most part, playing by the same set of rules to try to make arguments to persuade their colleagues and others, and very narrowly sometimes reach conclusions that are very hard to construe as just good versus evil or stupid versus smart. And the practice and skill of trying to do that in our own ordinary arguments is a really good thing onto. You don't have to do it with a neo-Nazi. You get a pass with that person. But most of us probably aren't actually, getting lunch with the Nazis. So for most of us, that person who infuriates you or who you think is just, unreachable or out of bounds, there's probably still something that you can learn from that person. There's probably still a conversation to be had. There's probably still a lunch to share.
I said his book was convicting, so thanks, John. Okay, in your chapter on forgiveness, there was a footnote that really moved me, and so I'm going to read
So impressed you read the footnotes. Western Street.
So for those who are not aware, during World War II, your paternal grandparents were interned in a Japanese American camp in California. And your dad was actually born in the camp. And the experience was harrowing, and you attribute your grandfather's untimely death to his experience in the camp. And yet you write so movingly about your grandmother's extension of forgiveness after Reagan gave her, I guess, reparations. And then she told your cousin, I don't hold any resentment against the government for being sent to the camps. I think they or someone panicked. We all know now that it wasn't necessary to put us there, but I don't resent them for what they did. I am still proud to be here and to be a citizen. Which is very powerful to me. So forgiveness is challenging even in the best circumstances. But we all have been recipients of forgiveness and we know how important it is. And in the book, you also bring up more public examples like the Amish school shooting and the Charleston church shooting. So I'm wondering, how can we, in our own kind of circles, foster forgiveness in public spaces without sacrificing accountability?
Yeah, I mean, so great. The last point is key. Forgiveness does not need to come to the exclusion of accountability and sometimes legal accountability. So that's important. But also, and conceptually and philosophically and theologically, forgiveness does not depend upon repentance. Forgiveness and repentance together can lead to reconciliation. That's maybe the ideal, but even in the absence of repentance, you can still forgive. And that can be very freeing for, as an exemplar to the rest of society, but also to you as an individual, that what you're saying, this is Hannah Arendt and others, right? I'm not letting you have the power over me that you would otherwise have. But I think in the case of, this particular example that you raised with my own family, and it illustrates the point more broadly, sometimes I feel like in our culture today, there are often calls for very cheap forgiveness that just say, like, just move on or don't worry about it. And one of the things that hit me anew with my grandmother was just finally starting to understand the depth and the cost to the harm that she suffered. And what I write about in this book is actually going to visit Manzanar internment camp 2 years ago, the first time I'd ever been there. It's the middle of the California desert, and walking onto the park ranger took me to the spot where they were incarcerated, and it's just sand right now. But I could imagine this 400 square feet where 7 of them were for 3 years, and there were shards of pottery on the ground still. And I was thinking that maybe my dad, maybe this is like a cup that my dad had for my grandmother. And kind of visualizing that and feeling that in a new way, very viscerally made the cost of the whole thing far more real to me than just having heard about it over the years. And then to go back to my grandmother's act of forgiveness in that context and say, this was a very costly form of forgiveness, but because of how costly it was also extremely powerful and freeing for her, and maybe for others in our family. I think as we model that in big and small ways for each other, we have the capacity to think differently about the world. So when Desmond Tutu writes the book out of South Africa, No Future Without Forgiveness, I think he's making a very political claim. There is no future politically without the possibility of forgiving one another, because as human beings who are self-interested and imperfect, we are going to keep hurting each other in big and small ways over and over again. And either we just keep fighting for vengeance or keeping score, or we figure out a different path forward. And forgiveness is one of those paths that I think gives us real possibilities.
So to talk a little bit more about forgiveness, Tim, the late great Tim Keller said, you have to know who you're forgiving, right? You have to know the identity of your person that you're forgiving, something like that. And I'm just wondering, we don't have to make this theological, but I'm just wondering, like, how do we forgive institutions or systems that have harmed us? And you're touching on this with your grandmother. So can you talk a bit more about that, when a lot of people in this country feel rightfully wronged by what this country's done? So how can you talk about that level of forgiveness, or who are they forgiving, and how do we take responsibility as well?
Right. Yeah. And Tim was a friend and co-author, and I hesitate to disagree, but I think he's probably wrong on this point. So the example that comes to my mind, which doesn't make it into the book, but is a true story for me. I was walking through the Austin airport, and I walk very briskly because I'm always trying to catch the flight or whatever. And I was walking through the Austin airport, and I slid on a blueberry, like a single blueberry, in the middle of the terminal, and I just went sprawling. And I mean, I had my suitcase, and I was wearing a suit, and I was all over the floor sprawling. And the first thing I do, I look up, and there are these fraternity guys just totally laughing at me. And then the gate agent runs up because she thinks that I'm extremely hurt. And it was just my pride that was hurt. But I immediately thought, like, who can I blame for the blueberry? Right? This is like, and really, I was sore, but I could have actually been quite hurt. And who would be accountable? Who would I even think about forgiving for this extreme harm of the blueberry? I mean, someone maybe was negligent, or who knows? But it's a version of the question you're asking. When something happens to you in the world, and sometimes it's a blueberry, or sometimes it's an institution or a structure, and you know that you have been wronged. You know that life is not actually going in the direction you thought it would go or hoped it would go because of this sometimes very intentional wrongdoing, or sometimes unintentional. And what do you do with that? So I think you have to have a capacity to say, if not a direct act of forgiveness, then a recognition that I have to move on in the world and recognize. This is where I think for a lot of people, having some kind of commitment to faith or something else that says that I'm trusting in a better scorekeeping than the one I'm feeling right now. Because if all I had were today, I would just be sore with a blueberry all over my suit, right? But instead, I can think like something else is on the line here. Yeah, and I think there's also a related just recognition that we live in a world where bad things happen, and sometimes it's unexplainable. And other times, it is an amalgam of human actions that become enculturated in institutional structures that are no longer tied to a single individual. So you can't really say, I'm going to hold that person accountable for racism or whatever it is, but it's still out there in the world. You can work to reform structures, and you can work to look for methods of accountability. But if you let the fact of the world just limit you or confine you or keep you down, then you're in some ways actually lessening your own ability to work back and push back against those structures.
We're gonna open it up for questions, and Alana's gonna take my microphone in just a minute. But I wanted to ask one more question, whether you believe there's an openness. Do you see an openness for complexity and nuance, right? Like conversations like this, an audience willing to come to this on a Friday at 3:00 gives me hope. I'm gonna go home, put the babies down, turn on the news, and feel hopeless again. So I'm just wondering, like, am I, like, can you make me feel a little bit better about this? Okay.
I think like,
do they want complexity with the other side? Like, do you see that people actually want to have complexity? Do people actually want to have complexity and understanding of the other side?
Yeah, some people do and some people don't. I think a lot of people don't, right? So I think first off, those like gathering in an academic room on a Friday afternoon at a university, like you all and we are the exception rather than the rule, right? Most people are not doing this. And most people, I think, especially within the university, we overestimate how much people care about what we do. Like most people don't care. They care about family and sports, and some of them are working 3 jobs, and life is hard. So nuance, like who has time for nuance? And that's where what fills the gap, news or social media, becomes important. And it's, as we've already said, is lessening in its depth and really expertise. So in place of that, for the rest of us, maybe what we can do is commit to nuance in a few things. Like we're not going to understand nuance in the world writ large. That's just not possible. We don't have the capacity. So if there are a few issues we care about, can we get smart about them? Can we learn deeply about them? Can we have extended conversations about them? most hard issues are hard for a reason, and they're not going to be resolvable by tweets or Facebook posts or whatever it is. You have to have lots of back and forth and discussion, and you have to be pressed on the points you're making, but you have to do that within the context of relationship and trust and time. And so I think actually maybe that's the point, that nuance depends upon time.
Mm.
And if we're not willing to commit to time, then we shouldn't expect nuance.
Thank you. I don't have a microphone. So.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I appreciate the conversation. So my name is Ursula. I have a t-shirt. When I wear this t-shirt, I mean everything on this t-shirt. And it says, I do not have the time, the patience, or the crayons to explain this to you. So there are days when I am just not at all interested in helping you be better. So I know I'm already opening up with a big thing that says, get away from me. Do not care what your problem is today. I'm not here for it. But that's only a few days. So most days, I don't have on the shirt. And someone says something, I still feel like I don't care to help you understand that. I want to say, Google it. However, I understand that that's not good for me, not good for I'm going to go home tonight and think, oh man, I should have said this. So how does a person get through that feeling when I know I really want to have this dialogue, but right now I'm staunchly in Google?
Yeah. I mean, that's great. I don't have the shirt, but I sentiment. So part of it, I think, is just, we have to discern at least two things. One, who are we supposed to be doing this with? It can't be the world. And actually, this is hard for me to internalize, because since writing this book, I just get a lot of emails from people who want to share their thoughts. Most of them are very genuine, thoughtful emails, but I just don't have the time in the day to respond to all of the people writing in. And there's almost like a hero complex we can get, right? Oh, it's up to me to help you through all this. And that's just not true. Like, we only have a set amount of time and relational capacity in our lives. So what is that? Who are the actual people who are crossing your path each day, where you discern you need to be? And then sometimes, even within that, there's a second kind of discernment that says, am I personally ready or in the right space for this conversation? And it might just be a t-shirt day where you have to say, you know what, not today. And I have a couple examples in the book where this happens, where even with someone I know relationally, to whom I'm connected, I realize I just can't do this today because I'm tired or I'm exhausted, whatever it is, that today's not the right day. So knowing the timing and the context. And then maybe a third thing that comes to mind is, and this might be personality dependent, but I am someone who pretends like I can compartmentalize very well. Like, I can just have that conversation and it won't affect me. But what I'm learning slowly about myself is that's not totally true either. That all of this kind of matters and takes. There used to be a time where I would write, say an op-ed, for example, and then I would get this stream of hate mail, and I would just pretend like, oh, who cares? They don't know me. But then I realized, you know what? Actually, enough hate mail starts to get to you, and I'm generally a nice guy, but when it comes, I need to prepare myself for that. And sometimes put on a t-shirt, or sometimes just take a walk. And so maybe a lot of that is just sort of a self-recognition of our finitude, and that we're not capable of or supposed to be the ones always providing the answers or the path.
We go back here.
So, John, two maybe disconnected but still connected items. How much of the disagreement or forgiveness are to expectations? That our expectations from each other, but our expectation to our own self, which leads to the second part, that what do you think, how do you learn to reconcile with yourself? Because the disagreement, not always with others, but disagreement should be, if you're talking about Elizabeth, then it's talking with it's dealing with 5 kids, but then it's a news. So the biggest disagreement is you have it with yourself at that point. And how do you learn to reconcile? Because unless you learn to forgive yourself, you can't forgive others.
Yeah, that makes me think of the passage in the Bible. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. If you hate yourself, you're not going to love your neighbor very well. So there is a sort of precondition to understanding yourself. And so maybe there's a bit of, we all have to have a bit of grace with ourselves that then might also extend that to people when you realize I'm not gonna get this right every time. This is hard, for classroom teachers, right? Because you just like inevitably screw it up. As much as you want to be clear and reach every student perfectly, it doesn't happen. And so to realize there has to be some grace in how we communicate and our own inability to do so. But actually, I think if you're already at the point of internal tension, you've taken a good first step, because internal tension usually conjures up some degree of humility that might otherwise be absent. The people that worry me the most are the people who have no internal tension, who just think I've got it, right? And I'm perfect and I know everything. And so part of what I think the educational process is inviting that internal tension and that complexity, and recognizing that it's okay not to have it perfectly figured out, or to introduce doubts to your own position, or to recognize that a lot of knowledge is actually a continuing conversation rather than a final destination, or the idea of learning. Learning, not just to disagree, but learning about anything is an ongoing activity. And I think that's a way to introduce a bit of grace and humility in the whole enterprise of being a human being.
Hi, John. Steve and I thank you for the talk. I'm very much looking forward to your book. I'm wondering, in your research, if you sort of identified a qualitative difference in the type of disagreement on a scale of sort of at one end, the most ideological, conceptual, existential, and perhaps farthest from my immediate life, down to disagreements that are concretely affecting directly and immediately me and somebody else. So the difference between, you're an evil person in the other party who's leading democracy off the cliff, versus I'm talking to my wife and she wants to remodel the bathroom, and I think that's insane because we need that money to do whatever else we need to do, and we've got to work that out. That's a very concrete thing. So I wonder if there is a kind of qualitative spectrum, and hence maybe any difference in the tactics you might use in those different points on that spectrum?
Yeah, it's a great question. Never thought of. There is something with those closest to us, I think, because they're proximate and in 3D, and we've got to see them the next day. Usually, we're going to regulate how we treat them. Usually, right? They're unhealthy examples, but for the most part, we're going to modulate our words, and we're going to try a little harder to understand, and we're at least going to maintain a relational connection. Once we extract that to those other people on social media or that politician I'll never see, then we can just let it fly. And so I think there's a sense in which the language we use, or the caricaturing of someone we don't actually know, comes more naturally in those settings. And that might lead to some kind of qualitative difference. But as I say that, so that's my intuition, but then I think, like in both of those examples you named, at the limits, I can feel my own body boiling up, right? I can get really mad at an argument with my wife, or I can get really mad at that politician. And it's the same kind of like, you just don't get it, you don't understand me. Yeah. One helpful possible check in both of those settings, although it's maybe especially apt for the distance setting. I was with a guy named Tim Schreiber a couple months ago. Tim is the chair of the Special Olympics Committee, and he's worked on a tool called the Dignity Index. You can Google this and find it online. It's just a measure of the language and word used, from sort of the inviting, you're a human being, I'm in a relationship with you and I care about you, all the way down to the ultimately humanizing. And so he just says, check this out, think about it in the way that you talk about other people, the way that you hear other people described, especially with any kind of fundraising letter. If you're down, if you get a fundraising letter that's describing those people with a 6 or a 7, just toss it out, because that's the kind of stuff that's destroying our social fabric. And I think it's a useful way to think about how we can start to veer into those descriptions and discussions of the people we don't know.
Hello, so I have like friends background that I'm great friends with already, like I have that background of like being trust. But I only get to see them when I go home like a couple times a year, and I want to have these conversations with them sometimes about like why they believe what they believe, but I only have like such a limited time with them. How would you suggest I go about bringing up more difficult topics when I like only get to see them in person for a couple hours, a couple times a year?
Yeah, I think, and that, I think a lot of us, especially in the university world, feel that with a set of relationships. So I would first say, set modest goals. I mean, you've already kind of named and described a repositioned relationship, right? Maybe years ago, you saw this person every day and have all the time in the world, and now it's very limited. So with modest goals, rather than say, why are you voting for so-and-so? Maybe pick an issue and say, can we talk through about how you come to believe what you do about this particular issue, and get them, rather than start with the debate, get them to tell a story. Tell me why what in your life experiences has led you here? I want to understand, maybe that first conversation is just listening to them and asking clarifying questions, or maybe agreeing, we're going to do this one direction and then I want you to ask me. But I think with a couple hours of time over a break, pick an issue or two and work on trust building of the relationship, not trying to understand the fullness of this divide you now have.
Yeah.
Gail Jackson. I have a group of friends with whom I've done a ski trip for 25 years, and we know we share a lot of interests in common, and for the most part, conversation revolves around the snow conditions and the falls of the day and what restaurant at night. In more recent years, when we've gotten into politics, there have been what I would call ad hominem comments or very snide comments about the political leaders of the party that they disparage. I find my blood starting to boil when these snide comments that are attacks on the person rather than their behavior start being made. And so far, my solution has been to stop doing the ski trips, which is rather sad. So what suggestions do you have when someone uses very snide remarks? They're not really arguments in favor of a point of view. They are trying to attack the person personally and often in a way that is not representative of the way the person actually behaves.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of the conversation we were having about the person on the other side who actually doesn't want to see the person rather than the problem, but just wants to be combative. And the challenge there, if you're going to make an intervention, how do you do it in a way that is not condescending or pedantic, or so is there a way to maybe not in the context of one of those comments being made, but just over dinner or, planning the next ski trip, can you say, I wonder if we would be able to think about a different way of talking about politics or our views of the country, and instead of mentioning any people in particular, could we focus this trip on just one? It's kind of like the question we were just having, one issue that we want to describe. But what's hard about the example you're naming is the premise might just be this person just wants to vent and snark, and so then it's either figure out a way to let that go and not have it get to you, or dump on the ski trip, which might be, and I think there are sadly lots of ski trip examples happening right now in this country. But it's with relationships worth having for most people, you do want a shared commitment to some kind of rules of the game. But you can say, we can disagree about who should be president, we can disagree about this policy, or even what counts as flourishing or harm, but we should at least agree to have a mode of engagement that is respectful of other human beings, that is curious, that asks follow-up questions. This is that, sometimes I get accused of being a moderate or a centrist, which I don't like at all, because it suggests, I've got viewpoints that are at the middle of two extremes, which is just not true for anyone. But I do think I have a kind of moderate temperament that says, well, let's have a discussion. Maybe you're right. Try to persuade me. Let's be curious. Let's be kind and respectful. We can even talk about really hard issues. And then also, and this is, I think, where the lawyer skill kind of comes in. Not that you have to be a lawyer to do this, but just this is a trick in law school. Whenever I hear a student say always or never or some kind of adverb, that's the moment I know I can go in and say, well, I don't think so. Right? Or when I see a brief written with an absolute claim. So then can we collectively dial back the absolutist claims, the rhetoric that avoids the nuance, and just say, maybe, like, tell me more about that view, but it's probably not true that all of those people always do that, or those people never do that.
So John, thank you. I just, before we all go and have a glass of wine and disagree with each other,
Wine also helps.
Wine does help. So after listening to this, can you just give, maybe a practical tip, someone who's sitting here who's thinking like, I just want to be better at this. I want to see the person, not the problem. I want to learn to disagree more. I don't know. I want to be more empathetic, or yeah. Can you just think of one or two practical things to tell that person who may or may not be me?
Well, so
Tell me how to do that.
asking for a friend.
And yep.
I think I would actually just back it up even further and say, are you being honest with yourself? Right? Do you have diverse news feeds? Do the people around you, what they say, you actually are hearing current events and politics from lots of various sources? And if not, start there. There's a free email you can get called Ground News, which points out, how left and right and center media is covering different events, and also points out blind spots from each. So start there. You could get something called Wake Up to Politics, which is from a St. Louis Burroughs grad that's very well done about sort of the news out of Washington. So ask yourself for diverse news feeds, and ask yourself if you're really getting that. And then ask yourself, and this is hard because we deceive ourselves so easily, but maybe ask your friends to tell you, are you a person who needs to have a little more courage to raise some hard issues, or are you a person who needs to talk a little less? And then start to work on whatever that is, and start with yourself as you move out into the world.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. So thank you all so much for coming. If this is your first time at the Weidenbaum Center, we have conversations like this all the time, and all of you should have gotten a event page. The one I'd love to highlight is November 18th. We are co-sponsoring an event with John's group, the Legal Vocational Fellowship, and we are I guess you could also talk about this if you wanted to briefly, Barbara and.
Sure,
Ben.
yeah, this, we just kind of put this together
Yeah.
pretty quickly, but I was introduced to a woman, Barb Haggerty, who writes, we used to be at NPR, writes for The Atlantic, and she was writing a story for The Atlantic on wrongful incarceration and convictions, and she was speaking to some of the first gen Innocence Project folks and said, what's the one story that haunts you? And they said Ben Spencer. And Ben Spencer is a Black man who was in prison in Texas for a murder and spent 34 years in prison, never maintained his innocence the whole time. And then because of Barb writes a story in The Atlantic about it, they bring in private investigators, go down, finally convince the Texas courts that they got it wrong. So he was free 3 years ago and exonerated last month. And it's a pretty incredible story about the obvious flaws in our justice system, but also just the human spirit that doesn't give, and really the conviction of both of them, Barb in her writing and Ben, and just persevering and never giving in to, they kept telling him, if you just confessed, you would have been paroled 20 years ago. And he said, I'm not gonna confess to something I didn't do. And, they are remarkable people and they'll be here.
They both will be here on November 18th. So, and I believe that is in the law school. So, please join us for that. And please, as mentioned earlier, John's book that he's been discussing is for sale right outside. And he's happy to continue to talk, right?
Yeah.
And drink some wine. And thank you all so much for coming.